everything working. This is the moment where we have to see whether technology works. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. As Erica said, please feel free to interrupt me at any moment when you have questions or ideas, or you want to say something. I will be more than happy to have an interactive presentation. Today, I'm going to give you some idea about executive function in Down syndrome, and particularly I will talk about assessment and about training, so ideas about how to foster executive function in individuals with Down syndrome. As Erica said, I'm from the University of Padova. This is a picture of the ancient building of the university. Unfortunately, I don't work in this very ancient building. I work in a more modern one, the Department of Developmental Psychology and Socialization. And I work mainly about children with intellectual disability, and in particular about Down syndrome. And I started to work about Down syndrome from a research perspective. I was telling to Erica and Nadina, my first study was about working memory in Down syndrome, and my doctoral thesis was about executive function in Down syndrome. And for many years, I have done research about Down syndrome. But working with children with Down syndrome and the experience of meeting those children and meeting those families gave me the idea that when you work with this population, you cannot do just research. When family comes for doing experiment, they ask you a question about how they can support, and parents ask question about how they can support the development of their child. They can ask question about everyday life. They ask question about the behavior of their child. And so I had the feeling that doing research was not enough, and there always is another side of the question, that is the clinical activities. So using the results of the research in order to support, to help those kids and their family. And that's why in the last year, together with the research of activities at the University of Padova, we also started a clinical service that is called Camminando per Mano, that means walking by hands. And it's a clinical service where we offer to the families assessment, but also support for the intervention, and also counseling when they need to be supported through many different problems in everyday life. Today, I'm going to talk mainly about executive function. Here is a tentative definition of executive function. So we can define executive function as an umbrella term that describes a set of higher order cognitive processes that are important for completing goals. For example, working memory, inhibition, planning, emotional regulation, cognitive flexibilities are executive function. In the literature, there are many studies that tried to explore executive function in children, adolescents, and also adults with Down syndrome. This is one of the first systematical studies on executive function. And from these studies, several others tried to explore executive function in children with Down syndrome in a systematic way, trying to differentiate between different executive function and trying to differentiate as well between the verbal and the visuospatial components of executive function, since we know that the profile of children with Down syndrome as it's a peaks and valley profile with more difficulties in language respect to a relative strength area in the visuospatial abilities. The first study in the literature used all direct measure laboratory task to assess executive function. And back in 2010, we did also with my research group at that time, we did a study as well about the profile of executive function in adolescents with Down syndrome. We assessed the working memory, inhibition, set shifting, conceptual shifting, planning, and fluency through a series of tasks normally used in the clinical activity to assess executive function. And what we saw was a pattern of broad impairment of executive function respect to not only to chronological age, but also to mental age. And this recent meta-analysis tried to synthesize the results of all the studies conducted so far. And what we can see, it's a profile. We can see that executive function are an area of weakness in the profile of individuals with Down syndrome. And the area that involve more difficulty are the area of working memory. The great majority of the studies see difficulties specific in working memory, especially in verbal working memory. But other areas of difficulty are shifting and also inhibition. This synthesis of the literature about studies that directly assess the executive function in individuals with Down syndrome leave also some open questions about this topic. And those are mainly methodological questions that apply to the research fields, but that apply as well to the clinical field. So the main question is what tasks or tests should be used to assess executive function in this population? And this is a critical question for individuals with Down syndromes, but also more broadly for individuals with intellectual disability, since in this population there is a discrepancy between chronological and mental age. And if we use the tasks or the tests that are appropriate for chronological age, in many cases, those are not very informative about the specific skills of a child because they are too difficult. And so the floor effect not allow us to see the real skills of the child. And this is not helpful, both from the research point of view, where we are interested in seeing inter-individual variabilities, but also on the clinical side, when we have to understand what are the skills of a child in order to decide what will be the goals of the intervention. The alternative could be to use easier tasks that are more appropriate for mental age. But Also, this alternative poses some problems, since in many cases we don't have norms appropriate for the chronological age, because we have norms for kids' age, but if we are testing an adolescent, we don't have norms, so we have to use raw data if we are doing research, or qualitative interpretation of the results if we are in the clinical field. And sometimes tasks that are for younger kids pose some problems on the motivational side, because if we are testing an adolescent, maybe he might be not very motivated in doing tasks that have as a stimula a teddy bear, a doll, or something that is more appropriate for kids. And so even this could be not the better choice. So one problem is still in the task that could be more appropriate to assess executive function, both from research and from clinical point of view. In the last year, another type of tools to assess executive function became more and more popular. I'm referring to tasks in the indirect assessment, where we assess executive function not proposing tasks directly to the child, but asking questions to parents that report us the behavior of the child during everyday life. And for example, one of the tools that is more popular, at least in Italy, to assess indirectly executive function is a brief in its preschooler version, and in its version brief 2, it's for kids, school-age children. And if we look at the literature, many studies have been conducted using brief in order to have more information about the profile of executive function in children and adolescents with Down syndrome. And all those studies give us more information about the profile. And one of the advantages of brief is that we avoid the floor effect. So all the information that we receive are informative in order to understand the profile of those children. And we can use brief for a broad range of age. So also some studies that compared the different ages was carried out in order to understand not only the a general picture of executive function, but also in order to understand whether there is some kind of evolution, some kind of change across ages in executive function. So most of those studies are cross-sectional, but the ideas behind is still to try to look at developmental trajectories. Of course, longitudinal studies will be better, but we all know that we need a lot of effort and a lot of time in order to run a longitudinal studies, and so cross-sectional studies are a good point to start in order to understand developmental trajectory. In the last year, together with my research group, we also have carried out a study on executive function in individuals with Down syndrome, with this idea to compare preschool-age children and school-age children in order to have a look also at the development of executive function. This is the profile of executive function that emerge in preschool age children. those are the scores in brief P, where higher score indicates more problems in a specific executive function domain. So we can see that at preschool age, the area of major weakness is working memory, and the area of strength is emotional control. In this table, you can see the percentage of kids in the sample that took part in the study that has a score that is above the cutoff for clinical attention. And we can see that the 47.5%, so almost the 50% of the kids in the sample showed a critical score for working memory. And only the 5% showed a critical score for emotional control. So this could be considered an area of relative strength in the profile. This is what happens at school age. So there are more executive functions that are assessed in the brief 2 respect to the brief P. And we can see that working memory remains an area of weakness, together with shifting, together with inhibition, planning, organization, and task monitor. And emotional control remain an area of strength, together with the organization of material. And we could speculate that this is due to the fact that organization of material is something that you may learn through routines. And so that the education for those kids and the education that use also routine as a way to help the child in organize the material, for example, in preparing the bag for school or preparing the clothes for getting dressed, is something that may help them in learn how to organize the material in order to be ready for the activities that needs to be performed. So all those studies, trying to summarize them all together, bring us what I think it's the first challenge in the domain of assessment of executive function. So the question is that I think that the time are ready for trying to find some tasks that specific for intellectual disability, and more specifically tasks that could be specific for Down syndrome. So we have discussed that both tasks that are appropriate for typically developing children, both for chronological age or for mental age, are not perfect and present some problem. So the idea is to making some effort in order to create specific tasks to assess executive function in Down syndrome that could be helpful both on the research side in order to study more in deep executive function in this population, but also on the clinical point of view in order to better understand the characteristics of each specific child that we meet during clinical activities. I know that around the world there are several research groups that are working in this direction, that have understood that it's very important to find not only for executive function, but more in general for the assessment of all the cognitive and behavioral aspects that could be important to have a specific task for intellectual disabilities, and that are doing effort in order to create a specific battery of tasks. So maybe in the future we will have those tools to assess executive function. For the moment, the solution could be to combine direct and indirect assessment. So using direct task with the child help us to see directly the skills that you use in solving some particular situation, some particular problem. From the indirect point of view, we have the possibility also to have information that comes from daily life. And so combining the two things, I think that could be at the moment a good way to have a more comprehensive profile of the executive function. Of course, all those data needs to be interpreted using clinical judgment, so understanding the situation, understanding the environment where the child lives, in order to give a meaning to the data that comes from direct and indirect assessment. Talking about the studies on typical development, there are a number of studies that demonstrate the relationship between executive function and everyday life. And so one of the reasons for why such an importance has been given to the study of executive function is because executive function support a numbers of activities during everyday life. And also some studies have been conducted in order to understand the impact that executive function has in everyday life in a typical population, such as individuals with Down syndrome. This is, for example, another study that we ran in the last year. This is the same studies as before, but this is the second part of the study where we looked at the relationship between executive function and adaptive behavior in everyday life. And this is the framework that emerged about preschool children. So we found a significant relationship between working memory and communication. So also in children with Down syndrome, working memory support communication, the emergence of language and communication skills. But what is interesting to see is what happens in school-age children. As you can see, in school-age children, almost all executive function considered by the brief correlate with all the domain of adaptive behavior as assessed through Vineland-2. So communication, daily living skills, and socialization. And this is probably due to the fact that everyday life at the school age becomes more requiring for the child, ask more skills in order to be coped. And for this reason, as executive function becomes more and more important in supporting all the action, all the activities that the child performs during its life. Other studies looked, for example, at the relationship between executive function and academic achievement in children with Down syndrome, and also in this case a relationship has been found between executive function and in particular working memory and reading and math skills. So once again, working memory is the executive function that correlates more with everyday life, but it's also the executive function that is more impaired in children with Down syndrome. And still, even if it's impaired, it supports everyday life. And for this reason, I believe it's important to think about working memory and to think about how is it possible to foster working memory in order, and all the executive function, in order to better support everyday life skills. And finally, we also have this study where the relationship between executive function and maladaptive behaviors in children with Down syndrome has been studied. And we can see that executive function correlate with attention problem, rule-breaking problem, aggressive behavior, externalizing behavior. So the more there are problems in executive function, the more there are problems on the behavioral side. And so fostering executive function could be something that helps also on the behavioral point of view in order to reduce maladaptive behavior. So this study led us to the second challenge that I want to discuss with you. Since on one side, executive function are very important for everyday life, but on the other side, executive function are an area of weakness in the profile of children with Down syndrome. It's important to find a way to foster executive function and to try to do it as soon as possible, since we know that early intervention is something that has more possibility to be successful, but also because it has a cascade effects on other domains of development and on other skills. So training executive function at early age could be something that support the development of adaptive behavior, and that helps the child to be more ready in order to cope, for example, with school environment in late years. And that's why I would like to use the last part of my presentation to talk to you about a project that is called the EXPO project to foster executive function at early age in children with Down syndrome. The name EXPO stands for Executive Function Play Opportunities, and this is a project that my research group is currently running together with the research group of the Professor Deborah Fiedler at the University of Colorado, and this first part of the study is supported by the Jérôme Lejeune Foundation. So it's a joint project with the idea of being also cross-cultural, so to working on something that is the core aspects of executive function. This could be the idea, and to decline it, to have different declination in different culture, in this case, the Italian and the American culture. So we worked together for almost 2 years, little less than 2 years, in order to develop the EXPO program. This is the picture of the Italian manual for parents. This project has been built having in mind the profile of children with Down syndrome. So usually so far, at least in Italy, the training program that we have to foster executive function are developed for typically developing children, and then they are adapted for being used with children with Down syndrome. In this project, we wanted to follow a different path, so we started from the profile of strengths and weaknesses that we know from the literature about cognitive functioning, cognitive and behavioral functioning of children with Down syndrome. And so we tried to build a project specific for children with Down syndrome. But we also wanted to use a community-based approach. So, so far, the attitude is that there is the psychologist has a package, he gives the package to the family and say, this is what you have to do this, and if you do exactly what I tell you, it will work. We want something that would involve also the families in the phases of building the training activities. We wanted to involve them as well in order to understand what are for them the problems in everyday life, what are the major challenges that executive function pose to these families in everyday life, and also what will be the domain, the area, they will prefer to work on during a training assessment. So we tried to combine the idea of the families, and for this reason we ran at the very beginning of the project, both in Italy and in US, some focus group with families of kids with Down syndrome in order to know their ideas, and we try to combine their ideas with the results of the research in order to have this double approach. And when the version 1.0 was ready, it went through a formative evaluation with the clinician or people that works in the research field in order to see from their point of view the feasibility of the program. We did some change according to the comments that we received during the formative evaluation, and then the version 2.0 of the program was ready. As I said, it's a training program. It's a series of activities that parents perform at home with their child during the everyday life routines. And there is an app, and parents record through the app all the activities that they do during everyday life with the child. And once a week, the parents meet an expert in order to discuss what they have done during the previous week, and in order to help the parents to choose the activities for the following week. The program starts working on the foundation. Foundation are some relational skills that are at the basis of all the activities to be performed with the child, like the ability to take turns or join attention. So on the first week of the program, the idea is to foster those skills that are at the basis of the work with the child. And then in the following week, there are activities to foster each specific executive function. The program lasts 12 weeks, and in every week, parent and child works on a specific executive function. There are some base activities and some expert activities. Expert activities are activities in order to consolidate and generalize the skills that have been achieved, and also in order to combine in one activities more than one executive function, since we know that reality is often more complex than how we categorize it in order to study it. And so the idea is also to find activities that helps the generalization and the combination of the skills that has been acquired through the activities. For each activity, we do to the parents a card where the activity is described and a video where the activity is showed. So the parent has the activity in advance, so it can read the card, it can watch the video, and he does every week. The parent has a pool of activities, and he chooses the one that he prefers, or because he likes them more, or because it thinks they might be more useful for the child, or because it thinks they are more appropriate for the context. And during the meeting with the coach, he discussed his choice with the coach, and they reach the final decision about the activities, and the coach gives suggestion about how to adapt the activities to the characteristics of that particular child. As you can see, for each activity, there is a suggested context, a setting, materials, the action that have to be done, some tips in order to perform or how to adapt the activities. And there are different levels of difficulties, since we know that there is a high inter-individual variabilities, and it is important that every child works within his zone of proximal development. It's important that each family find the right level of difficulty for his child, and that they works within this level of difficulty. So we are very clear with the family that is not a race, but each child has his own path, and what's important is that the child move some step within his path, that they don't have to make comparison between children, because every child is different. As I told you, there is an app, and parents, every time that the parents work with the child, they fill the app and with information about when the activities has been completed, how much did they enjoy, so if it was fun or if it was boring, because also the motivational side is important. It's important that the child is active, take actively part in the situation, and it's important also that the child is motivated, that he enjoy the activity. And it's important that also parents enjoy the activities, because if they have fun, there are more probability that the child has fun, and so the activity works well. And as I told you, there is also every week there is a meeting with a coach to discuss the previous week, and to discuss also whether there has been some problem in the relationship with the child in the activities. And the program has also a behavioral toolbox, so a series of tools that the coach can suggest to the parent in order to help the child to be more motivated, more focused. And for the other half of the meeting, they are discussing the new activities in order to find the activities that are more appropriate for the child and the adaptation that are more appropriate for the child. At the moment, we are running, both in Italy and the US, a pilot study about this version 2.0 of the training. This is not yet the final version. This pilot study will help us to understand whether the activities work, what are the activities that works better, what are the activities that may not work and needs to be changed in order to arrive to the 3.0 and hopefully final version of the program that will go through a randomized and controlled study. This pilot involve a pre-training where executive function, of course, are assessed, but also global development, adaptive behavior, and challenging behaviors in order to see also the effect of executive function on other domains. Then there is a period of training that lasts 12 weeks. And then there is a post-training where all the skills are tested again. And at the moment, we are just in the middle of the training. We are in our fourth 4th week of training. And so far, what we have seen is that family are very enthusiastic of the training. I guess they are having fun with their child in doing the activities. We also have families that are very creative, so they found a new way to adapt the activities. One family also created an expo song, and we will ask them to share it with us in order to create a proper play routine. So when we sing the expo song, then it's time to work about doing those activities. And well, I don't have results to present you about this. I hope to have them soon in the future, and I really hope that this training works, because I see those families very engaged. I've seen that also the weekly meeting with the supervisor are for them a good opportunity to share their ideas, to find an help in how to work with their child. But also I see that this program helps the parent to see that they have a number of opportunities to practice executive function in everyday life, through behavior, through things that we normally do in everyday life. If we have the idea that doing that activities, we are also fostering executive function. If we pay attention to those things, those are all opportunities that are embedded in everyday life. So we don't need specific training session, but if we are more aware of executive function in everyday life, we might work to improve them through everyday life activities. So in the end of my presentation, this is the website of our research group. Unfortunately, since it's new, it doesn't have an English version yet, but we are working in order to have it. So hopefully we will have also the English version soon. And let me conclude in this talk, thanking all the people that took part in all the research that I have described. So the group of people in the Camminando per Mano Syndrome di Down Lab, the association Down Daddy that helped us to recruit the families that are taking part in the pilot, the Foundation Jérôme Lejeune, and the research group that worked with us in the conducting several studies on the profile of executive function and more in general in cognition in individuals with Down syndrome. And thanks to all of you for your attention.